Group, which is a global strategy firm, and of Albright Capital Management, which is an investment advisory firm focused on emerging markets. Ambassador Sherman serves on the board of directors of Oxfam America and the board of advisors for the Center for a New American Security. She is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Aspen Strategy Group. Finally, she's also a member of the U.S.-India Strategic Dialogue. Our second guest is Dr. Ray Takeyh. He is the Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and contributing editor of the National Interest. His specializations are Iran, the Persian Gulf, and U.S. foreign policy. He is the author of several well-received books. In 2004, he published The Receding Shadow of the Prophet, The Rise and Fall of Radical Political Islam. In 2006, he published The Hidden Iran, Paradox and Power in the Islamic Republic. And he has a book forthcoming with Oxford University Press entitled The Guardians of the Revolution, Iran's Approach to the World. In recent years, Dr. Takeyh's articles and other writings have appeared in a wide range of publications, including Political Science Quarterly, American Prospect, Survival, Orbis, Middle East Journal, and Washington Quarterly. Dr. Takeyh was previously Professor of National Security Studies at the National War College, Professor and Director of Studies at the Near East and South Asia Center at National Defense University, Fellow in International Security Studies at Yale University, Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. We're going to begin tonight with Ambassador Sherman, who will speak for roughly 20 minutes on the general issues surrounding proliferation and terrorism. Then Dr. Takeyh will follow with a roughly 20-minute presentation on the case of Iran, and that will leave us with 20-30 minutes for questions, answers, and a discussion. Ambassador Sherman?
Thank you. Do you want us to come up there?
Yes, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, no problem. Good evening. It's great to be here this evening, and I thank all of the sponsors for this event, and delighted to be in Cleveland. And I go first because Ray's a lot funnier than I am. So when you're sort of starting to get tired out, he'll entertain you, and he's very delightful, so it'll pick it back up again. I have the job of sort of talking about broadly the threat that's in front of us and what, if anything, can be done about it. And both Senator McCain and Senator Obama, as we are, God willing, almost at the end of this election season, both have said that the greatest threat to the United States is a terrorist with a weapon of mass destruction, and most specifically, a nuclear weapon. So on that, they are quite agreed. Now, there is a lot of difference, which I'll talk about in a minute, about how great that threat might be and what we might do about it. But at least everybody's on the same page of concern, and you'll have to forgive my glasses. As Elliot mentioned, I'm on a commission which actually is going to report out sometime after the election with a horrible title of the Commission on Prevention of the Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction and Terrorism. So that's the entire cover page, right, just getting the title out. But what we were tasked to do, and it's really a fallout from the 9/11 Commission, what's left of the things that were never done, is to take a look at the threat that we face now, the nexus with terrorism, and what we can do about it. The report of the Commission focuses on both nuclear weapons and biological weapons. You will hear over the years, and students have probably heard, the acronym CBRN, and that stands for Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear Weapons. And most people believe that chemical weapons are something that our military is familiar with. If we had a chemical attack, it would be horrible, but it would not be a game changer, and people would know what to do probably. The disaster of it would be somewhat contained. We know how to clean up hazardous material of that sort. So it would be bad, but it would not be catastrophic. Radiological, which people talk about as the dirty bomb, is something that would emit radioactivity but not blow up like a bomb. And a radiological device obviously would be a very serious problem for the neighborhood or the city block where it was dumped and dispersed. It would be horrible. But again, most people don't believe that it would be a game changer in terms of changing really fundamental things about the world and how we operate. I wish I could say the same thing was true for a nuclear weapon or a biological weapon. I think personally that sometime in the next decade, the chance of a terrorist getting possession of a nuclear weapon is relatively low, maybe not more than 10 or 20%. I have colleagues on the commission, including Graham Allison, which I'm sure some of you have read his terrific book, Nuclear Terror, who believe that it is as high as 50% in the next decade. But the results of a nuclear weapon being used by a terrorist is so catastrophic and so game-changing that the world as we know it would not be the same again. Because not only would that nuclear weapon go off and be catastrophic, but we would likely retaliate, and we might retaliate with a nuclear weapon. And there are many more countries. It's no longer the United States and the Soviet Union sort of sidling up to each other and knowing they have mutual deterrent capability, mutually assured destruction. There are many more players now, and not all of the players are states, and so they are not deterred in conventional ways. Biological would be a game changer as well, because in fact, biological weapons could affect a wide universe of people, are very hard sometimes to even detect before the damage is done, hard to contain the damage from biological weapons. And as you all know from the discussion in the general press, probably the greatest fear we all have is a pandemic, which is a naturally causing biological event where you have a morphing of a bacteria that then can get transmitted from person to person, may turn into a viral form, and could cause millions of deaths. And it would change how we deal economically. If you all remember SARS, when it broke out in Hong Kong, and then parts of Asia, businesses stopped traveling, economies suffered, people were very wary of each other. It changed everything about human behavior in that arena. So, and we saw what the anthrax attack that we had did to us as a nation. Certainly those of us who lived in Washington or New York, where the anthrax showed up, life was pretty horrible for a long time. And anthrax occurs naturally, so it's much easier to get that substance. Harder to disperse, but easy to get. There are two different types of nuclear threats, state actors and non-state actors. And for virtually all of the 20th century, almost all of the 20th century, we were really worried about state actors, countries that had nuclear weapons who wanted to get nuclear weapons. But with 9/11, most profoundly, we began to be worried about non-state actors, people who really don't care about maintaining a government or maintaining their way of life. These are people who have understood that the world is now made up of systems, telecommunication systems, electric distribution systems, and they can take down the fiscal financial systems. And they can take down those systems, though we did a pretty good job on the financial system ourselves. They can take down those systems without regard to their own life because they don't live their lives according to those systems. They live in a different universe altogether. So they've created an asymmetric situation between the states and the non-state actors. Of the states with nuclear weapons, our concern is whether they've secured the material that's used to make nuclear weapons. That's usually either plutonium or highly enriched uranium, which is known as fissile material, the ingredient, the critical ingredient for a nuclear weapon. We're worried about whether that material can be stolen or whether someone might sell it because they're desperate. The potential that a state would use it when North Korea had 1 or 2 nuclear weapons at the beginning of the Clinton administration. We weren't happy about it, but the chances of them using it or selling it wasn't high because then they wouldn't have them anymore. And they used it as a deterrence against us. But if you have, as we believe North Korea now has, 8, 10, 12 nuclear weapons, you can use them, you can test them, and you can sell them. We're also worried that states who try to get nuclear weapons will set off an arms race. Ray is going to talk with enormous knowledge about Iran, and one of our many concerns about Iran is that if they got nuclear capable, then Saudi Arabia would believe it has to have nuclear weapons. Egypt would believe it has to have nuclear weapons. And we would see Turkey might decide it needs nuclear weapons. So we would have a swath of cascading desire to have nuclear weapons, and it would cascade out of control. For non-state actors, Al-Qaeda has said, quite literally, that they are trying to get nuclear weapons, and biological weapons for that matter, try to get nuclear weapons. They want to use those nuclear weapons. They want another Hiroshima. They mean to kill at least 2 million people with the use of a nuclear weapon. They have not been successful so far because it is hard. You have to have the material, you have to weaponize it, and you have to deliver it. But they're working on it very, very hard. There are 5 original nuclear states, and we call them the nuclear powers: the United States, Russia, Great Britain, France, and China. Not because there aren't other states that have nuclear weapons, but because when the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty came into force in 1970, a rule was laid down that those states who had tested a weapon before January 1st, 1967 would be considered nuclear states, and no one else would be. And anyone else who joined the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty would have joined the treaty, but would not be considered a nuclear state. And then, of course, we had Iran, India, and Pakistan that developed nuclear weapons but never signed up to the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So they were outside of the international regime. And obviously North Korea and Iran both joined the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, but both have defied the rules of that treaty. And North Korea actually declared that it was leaving the treaty. So it's had limited help, because it did help to get states like South Africa and Brazil not to pursue nuclear weapons, Korea not to pursue nuclear weapons, give them up, but it hasn't been entirely successful. The numbers of weapons that countries have is not entirely known because states don't want people to know, but to give you a rough idea, what's believed is that the U.S. and Russia probably have 5,000 or fewer weapons each. China, France, and Great Britain probably under 400 each, and China maybe as few as 200. Pakistan and India, perhaps 60. Maybe India has as many as 140. And you might know that in 1985, there were in the world 65,000 nuclear weapons. God knows why we needed 65,000 nuclear weapons, but fortunately we have built those down. 5,000, in my view, is still a heck of a lot too many. Iran, which we will hear about from Ray, is on the verge of producing enough fissile material to be able to create a weapon. And it is on a very specific timetable for getting a weapon, and that is why it is of such critical concern. But for me, the most dangerous place in the world where all of these factors come together is Pakistan. Pakistan is really a perfect storm. The Commission made a decision to go to Islamabad. We went to Moscow, we went to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. We visited London to have meetings with MI5 and understand how they try to pursue terrorist threats. Met with Scotland Yard. But we decided we needed to go to Islamabad because it is a perfect storm of terrorists in the Fatah region, terrorists inside Pakistan itself, not just on the border, a weak and unstable government, nuclear weapons, a lot of nuclear weapons, and a very poor country, very weak economy. Just applied to the IMF in this fiscal crisis for assistance. We landed in Kuwait on September 20th. We were due to go to Islamabad and stay in the Marriott Hotel. We got off of our airplane. Our BlackBerry started to buzz. We looked up at the screen and saw that the hotel we were about to stay in 8 hours later was in flames. and that it had been bombed by terrorists inside of Iraq, what's now known, inside Pakistan, what is now known as Pakistan's 9/11. And so we didn't go to Islamabad. Obviously, it was too much to ask that anybody see us in the midst of that horror. 52 people died. And it just reminded us all on the commission, besides calling our families and saying we weren't there yet, how dangerous, how difficult, how terrible a situation this is. So what are the main big things? I'm going to do this very fast so we can get to Iran and to Q&A. What are the things that we can do to try to stop someone stealing this material or a nuclear weapon, stop more states from becoming nuclear weapon states, try to get Iran and North Korea to roll back their nuclear weapons programs, and I'll be glad in Q&A to tell you funny stories about North Korea. And Kim Jong-il, who owns every Academy Award movie and has watched them all. But here are the things we can do. Make sure that the materials are safeguarded. We have had a cooperative threat reduction program with Russia for some time now. It's known as the Nunn-Lugar program, set up, conceived of by Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar. It has helped to build down their stockpiles, to secure their stockpiles, to blend down their highly enriched uranium so it's low enrichment as opposed to weapons capable. We're now looking at whether we should do that with some other countries around the world, try to get them to better secure their materials and their weapons. We need to eliminate nuclear weapons program. Iran, I'll set to the side. North Korea, we're on the road to progress. When President Bush came in, he decided he didn't want to talk to them. They were part of his axis of evil. So lo and behold, 7 years later, North Korea kept on churning out plutonium, started a highly enriched uranium program, which I'm not sure exists anymore, but churned out enough plutonium to go from having 1 to 2 nuclear weapons to having 8, 10, 12 nuclear weapons. Chris Hill, who's the negotiator and a superb negotiator, has gotten them to now close down Yongbyon for the second time, the reactor facility and the reprocessing facility. But it is a long way to go, and now that North Korea has so many more nuclear weapons, they have more chips on the table. They have more to bargain with. It's a harder thing to end. Syria, we know, tried to build a nuclear reactor plant with North Korea's help, and I forgot to mention one of the other delights of Pakistan is A.Q. Khan, who was the really inventor of Pakistan's nuclear program, was kind enough to share his understanding, his technology, and his information with Iran, with North Korea, with probably Syria, perhaps with Egypt, perhaps with Saudi Arabia. We don't know the extent. He's under home arrest because in Pakistan, and not in jail, because in Pakistan, A.Q. Khan is a hero because he gave Pakistan power in the world and brought them into the club. Some states believe they need to get nuclear power because it's the only way to deter the United States from attacking them. They don't want to be Iraq, they don't want to be Serbia, they want to be fully able to deter the last remaining superpower. We need to provide international leadership. The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty has problems, has some holes in it in the world. We need to fix that. We need to try to build nuclear detection architecture so that we know what's coming our way. We need to try to make sure that the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 puts into place nuclear security and accounting systems, and make sure that the IAEA has the resources it needs, because it doesn't right now. We need a lot better intelligence. We've come a long way since 9/11, but we still have a very, very long way to go. There isn't anybody who knows how Kim Jong-il is today. We don't have intelligence to tell us, did he really have a stroke? Is he incapacitated? Who's making the decisions in North Korea? We simply don't know, which is quite extraordinary when you think about it. There are a lot of other fancy things, cargo detection sensors along our borders, forensics, so that you know who sent the bomb so you can bomb them back. But I think fundamentally what's most important is to get broad national security policy right and to try to win back some hearts and minds. There is an effort going on in the moderate Islamic community to really create a value system that says using nuclear weapons to kill people is not kosher. Thank you. Whether that makes real progress or not remains to be seen. You all are probably sitting here and saying, well, this is all really lovely, so what the heck am I supposed to do about it? How can an ordinary citizen do anything about this? And what I would say to you is, besides being scared by it all, and the biological stuff for me is far scarier because it's much more likely. Besides being scared, doing what you're doing tonight is important, which is to just get educated, to get informed, to be able to ask questions of your political leaders, of your teachers, to then for the young people to go into government or into think tanks or into intelligence communities and try to help us figure out whether the ways to stop bad people from doing bad things to the rest of us. I'm going to turn it to Ray now. As I said, he's a lot funnier than I am. And then we'll be glad, we try to get a little humor in a really tough subject, and then we'll be glad to answer questions. Ray.
Thanks very much again for having us. It's always, I think I said this yesterday, it's always difficult to follow Wendy because they finish reading that biography, and I almost never look good in comparison. It was said that Harry Truman was never a small man, but he was small because he was inevitably compared with Franklin Roosevelt. So I'm not really a small man, but in this context, smaller at least. Today is actually an interesting day to talk about this issue because it is the 25-year anniversary of the 1983 bombing in Lebanon by Hezbollah that killed 241 American Marines. And Hezbollah, of course, has a connection to Iran, and it was that Iranian Hezbollah operation. Just to let you know that the challenge of Iran is not just proliferation. It is also terrorism, subversion, and so on and so forth, and the marriage between these factors. I should also note that 58 French forces died that same day in a terrorist bombing by Hezbollah, which reflects the fact that Iranian terrorism has not necessarily been targeted exclusively toward the United States, but some of America's allies, the Europeans, the Gulf states, of course, Israel. I want to give you an idea before I begin the discussion of Iranian proliferation tendencies, motivations, and so forth. Something about this complex political system that we call an Islamic Republic, some of the institutional makeups, and how it actually makes decisions, because it's an unfamiliar political system. I think it's fair to say that there's no political system quite like the Islamic Republic. It has series of institutions. Some are elected, some are non-elected, and as you can guess, those who are non-elected have most of the power. On the non-elected side, there is a guardian council whose responsibility it is to vet candidates and legislation to make sure they conform to Islamic standards. Now, recently it vetoes budgets and so forth. Now, I don't know why that's un-Islamic. What's un-Islamic about municipal budget, but who knows? There's another institution called Assembly of Experts, which is an elderly clerical body, 86 members. I think they say average age is deceased. But the responsibility is essentially to make sure that the Supreme Leader, there's some oversight over the Supreme Leader's office, and of course the Supreme Leader's office has almost all power in Iran, the power to make war and peace, the power to validate or invalidate elections, and it's occupied by Ali Khamenei. And there are a series of elected institutions. There's an Office of Presidency that is elected every 4 years, and rather circumscribed by competitive elections. There's a parliament that's elected again every 4 years, municipal councils, and so on. So there is a real politics and real institutions within Iran. And Iranians do take their elections seriously. They do participate in them. The rate of participation varies. That's why sometimes when Iranian elections are denigrated, it is something that doesn't work well in terms of public diplomacy. The national security decisions are made in something called the Supreme National Security Council, which is statutorily chaired by the president. And for those who say Iranian presidents don't have all that much power, there is some institutional leverage and some power that they do have. The Supreme Leader has 2 representatives to that office, and currently that individual is Saeed Jalili, his representative, and he's the one responsible for negotiating Iran's nuclear issue. Prior to that, it was Ali Larijani, so on and so forth. So that's how you begin to see this complex web of institutions is how the country governs itself. It's different than in sort of a hermetic North Korean state. It is different than typical Middle Eastern authoritarian states. It's much more interesting than that. That's why lumping them together doesn't work, because it's just much more complicated, much more interesting, and much more intriguing. It's a country that has real political give and take, real factions, and there are differences and disagreements, and these differences and disagreements are sort of a genetic in Iran's political fiber. It's a deeply factionalized country, perennially at odds with itself. So in that sense, it's not like any other political system that one can think of. I'm not a political scientist, but comparative politics doesn't work in this sense, because there's nothing quite like it. And there's an expediency council that mediates differences between institutions, therefore expediency. Now for the main issue, why does Iran want nuclear weapons? Why has it arrived at that particular decision? Which I think is fair to say, whenever a country embarks on a decision to have a nuclear weapons program, it is the most momentous and important decision that a political leadership will make, particularly when that decision is made ostensibly in violation of that country's treaty obligations. It is not an easy decision, so a series of important factors must have motivated a country to pursue that course of action. In terms of the Islamic Republic itself, I'll focus on that aspects of Iran's nuclear history, but it is important to note that nuclear weapons ambitions did not begin with the 1979 revolution. It actually predated that. Shah of Iran himself had nuclear weapons aspirations, as we come to know, but for a different set of reasons and different set of motivations. So today I'll focus more on why the current regime is searching for these particular categories of weapons. It's nearly impossible to talk about Iran's defense procurement, defense policy, defense doctrine, nuclear weapons, biological weapons, without discussion of probably the most important issue in its history, the Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War that lasted from 1980 to 1988 was probably the most searching experience that the country had. Particularly since many veterans of that particular conflict are coming to positions of power today. And I want to make one more statement about why Iran-Iraq War was such a unique experience. As remarkable as it may seem, for much of the war, from 1980 all the way to probably 1986, the Iranians fought that war largely by volunteers, people who kept volunteering for the conflict. And this is particularly remarkable given the fact that the way Iranians fought the war was human wave assaults. It was essentially trying to overcome technological superiority with sort of a revolutionary and religious zeal. It's to some extent, I mean, analogies are never perfect, but to some extent, the Iran-Iraq War resembles the Iraq War here in the United States in a sense that it didn't affect for a long time large segment of the population because they just ran that by volunteers. Most of the volunteers came from lower classes, working classes, and religious classes. So therefore, the veterans of that war have had experiences that are different from mainstream Iranian politicians or so forth. They just have a different sort of an attitude, different sort of perceptions, and their behavior is molded by certain experiences. I mean, as I said, the comparison with Iraq War would be given the fact that Iraq War in the United States is fought by a very small segment of society, a volunteer army. And most people are, in their daily lives, are unaffected by its carnage and its sacrifices and its struggles. For those who survived that conflict, and I think about 1 million Iranians eventually did perish and were injured and so forth as a result of that war, Iran was a country that suffered chemical weapons attacks, and it did so with impunity. And there's still about 10,000 survivors of those chemical weapons attacks. I mean, they keep dying. You know, the death happens almost every day as they continue to suffer from their wounds. And Iran is a country that lives its history. I mean, in one of the newspapers every day, Jumhuriyat Islami, which is a huge paper, an important paper, a reactionary paper, therefore important. Every day there's a testimonial of a martyr, as they call it. There's a picture, and there's where there was this individual born, when he died, and he has a small little sort of a commemoration that he wrote. Obviously, it was written for him. It was propagandistic, but some sort of his last written testimony before he died. Some of them tend to be rather emotive. You know, before they go to the front of the war, they would write a small self-obituary, usually a letter to their parents. Dear Mom and Dad, thank you for raising me, but now God has called me, and today I died for the cause of the Islamic Republic. Don't mourn. I am now in heaven. Ali Muqaddam, age 14, age 15, sometimes 20, 21. So it's a fairly, the Iran-Iraq war continues to, in a very real way, affect Iran's behavior and so forth. And it's a country that has not come to terms with its history with the war, much as the United States for long did not come to terms with its own history in terms of Vietnam War and took long periods of reconciliation. So how did the war affect Iran's weapons of mass destruction calculations, indeed non-conventional capability? Well, for one thing, it invalidated the concept that you can overcome technology through revolutionary zeal. That if you want deterrence, you have to have certain categories of proscribed weapons. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, and of course the ultimate strategic weapon. It invalidated for them the notion that, you know, there are certain international conventions that prohibit certain practices. Use of weapons of mass destruction against civilians is prohibited by international conventions, and therefore it isn't done. Well, actually, it is done. So the notion that the UN and others and the global public opinion should be counted as the country takes into consideration its defense planning has to some extent been damaged by that. It engendered a remarkable degree of suspicion of the international community and international organizations, particularly the United States and the other Western powers. And it also led to the notion of self-sufficiency and self-reliance. In that particular sense, Iran to some extent resembles other countries that have embarked on weapons of mass destruction program, namely they have to rely on their own indigenous capability for their defense, and they cannot rely on good opinions of mankind. So the war and the memories and the legacy of that war haunt the country and account for some of its weapons aspirations, non-conventional weapon aspirations. Iran lives, as is often said, in an unpredictable and unstable neighborhood. To me, that's less of a factor in motivating the country, to be rather contrarian about it. Because Iran it does not face an existential crisis. There is no country that wants to destroy Iran. India, Pakistan, for instance, being one case. Such an existential conflict leading to acquisition of nuclear weapons does not exist for Iran. Iran does face instability on its periphery in Central Asia and Afghanistan and so forth, in Iraq, but it's hard to see how nuclear weapons can mitigate that kind of instability. If you have nuclear weapons, how does that stop instability in Afghan civil war from seeping across your border? How does that help you ameliorate that strategic quandary? It's an important challenge for Iran, given some of the unstable neighbors that it has, but nevertheless, it is hard to see how nuclear weapons can help ameliorate those particular challenges. I think the fact that there are nuclear weapon states in Iran's periphery, whether it's Russia, India, Pakistan, if you look at Iran's nuclear discussions over a decade, and in order to have a viable assessment of it, you have to have a longer view. The notion that we have to have nuclear weapons because of Pakistan never comes up. I think, as I always say, The only time Pakistan's nuclear weapons issue came into Iranian public discussions was after the Pakistanis detonated the bomb 1998, whenever it was. I don't know when the Pakistanis detonated. That was the only time.
Sounds right.
And it was a celebration. It wasn't a threat. It was a celebration of an Islamic bomb. So, now this is something everybody can, everybody should be proud of. So they weren't saying this is a threat we should guard against. It was a moment of rejoicing and celebration. And I would say the same thing about Israel. So it's not the neighborhood, in my view. It's not the fact that there are countries in Iran's neighborhood that possess nuclear arms. And you can make a case, a rather reasonable case, indeed a cogent case, that Iran's strategic situation has improved since 9/11. Two of its adversaries are no longer there, and more importantly, they are displaced by regimes which Iran has very good relationships with. The Karzai government, and of course the Shia government in Iraq tend to be very, as a matter of fact, the rise of the Shia government in Iraq has revolutionized Gulf security. Gulf security as we knew it since the arrival of the British Empire in the Middle East no longer exists. And there is no Gulf security architecture replacing it. We don't know what Gulf security will look like as we move forward. We know it wasn't going to look like what went before, because Gulf security historically was an external empire making sure that the Gulf is stable and accessible. Whether the British Empire and subsequently the United States as a superpower. That's no longer the case. Iraq is no longer in existence and is no longer a barrier to Iranian power. And the United States today in the Gulf, and indeed, one sad to say, throughout the Middle East, is neither like nor respect. It's bad enough to be one, but when you're both, that's a fairly difficult situation. And there's the rise of Iranian power, which is filling the vacuum. So that's a good thing if you're Iranian, so you don't necessarily need nuclear weapons for security purposes. So why nuclear weapons? Well, for a combination of reasons, I think you can make a case that at the immediate 2001, 2002, the idea of deterrence against the United States was the primary motivation. I think that's still a motivation, given the long enmity between these two countries. But also nuclear weapons are often viewed as a means of assisting Iran to consolidate its new sphere of influence, as a means of allowing it to project its power with immunity. If Iran has nuclear weapons, it's no longer subject to attack by anyone, therefore it can presumably be more aggressive. It is often thought of nuclear weapons, nuclear science, nuclear technology, achievement in that particular realm as an attribute of a great civilization. So a combination of these things essentially lead Iran to move forward, a combination of deterrence, a means of projecting its influence, a means of consolidating its power, a means of consolidating its sphere of influence, and all those factors. They tend to be a connection, as I said before, between deterrence and between offense and defense. Nuclear weapons are designed to provide you defense, and with that defense you have assurances to become more offensive and more aggressive. And you can see anytime a country, particularly a volatile revolutionary country, achieves nuclear weapons capability, in that immediate period after that achievement, it tends to become more aggressive in pursuit of its foreign policy. We have few cases of that, but the cases we have, I think, validate that. China, that detonated this bomb in 1964, became much more aggressive in the years 1965, 1966, in terms of its intervention in civil wars in East Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on. Pakistan, India, I think Pakistan after its detonation became much more aggressive in prosecution of the Kashmir War. I think maybe that's ahistorical, but so what? If you're making a point, you can take liberty with historical facts. I'm going for consistency, not accuracy. So, Iran with nuclear weapons can be counted on to be more assertive in achievement of its aims. Iran, as we saw, is a multifactional country. It is a country divided against itself within the ruling regime. Obviously, there is divisions between the public and the state, but there are divisions within the state. For some, nuclear capability is an end of itself, and therefore they have a fairly narrow view. They tend to view the nuclear program within a very narrow confines, and they tend to be motivated by security factors and so on. Iranian president will certainly be in that category. For others, within the political system, the nuclear weapons, the nuclear capability is an important issue, but it is an issue in the context of Iran's larger international relations. What that means is they make their nuclear calculations while cognizant of other factors. How does this affect our commercial relationship with the Europeans? How does this affect our standing in the region? How does it affect our relationship potentially with the United States? How does nuclear weapons affect our entire range of commercial, political, and diplomatic relationships? If the answer to that is adversely affect all those, then that particularly may lead some to a degree of restraint. And I think that's why Iran suspended its nuclear program in the year 2002, 2003, is because the reformist government made a calculation that although the nuclear program is important, there are other factors that are more important. Relationship with the Europeans, United Nations rebuke, being censured by the international community. It was a government that was sensitive to international opinion. Not that it wasn't committed to the nuclear program. The nuclear program experiences its greatest revitalization during the time of the reformist government. But it was nevertheless, despite this commitment and despite this efficiency in achieving in advancing the nuclear program, it was a government that was cognizant and sensitive to international pressures and international opinion. So there are divisions within the country that potential United States diplomacy, I think, can exploit and leverage those cleavages. There has not been, in the past 8 years, such diplomacy that could take advantage of Iran's factional divisions and press Iran in the direction of nonproliferation as opposed to advancement of its program. We can talk about that a bit more in detail, but as Wendy mentioned, in case of Korea, during the first Bush years, there was a sort of an aversion to diplomacy toward Iran, toward Korea, certainly toward Iraq. During the second term, there has been some degree of penchant toward diplomacy, but that inclination has been undermined by insisting on unrealizable and self-defeating preconditions. So where does the program go from here? I think as a nuclear program develops in any country, it gains adherents, it gains patrons, it gains prestige, which makes nuclear reversal difficult. The longer a nuclear program is in existence, the more difficult it is to reverse it. There have been cases of nuclear reversal, South Africa. There have been other cases, Argentina, Brazil, certain Central Asian cases, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and so forth. But the longer the nuclear program evolves, the longer it matures, it becomes more difficult to reverse. Iran's program is not a crash program, but it is one of incremental and persistent progress. And today it has made remarkable progress. In the year 2001, 2002, Iran had no measurable enrichment capability. Today it has a fairly robust enrichment capability that is operating at 80% efficiency and relies on local indigenous technologies as opposed to imported ones. So the traditional mechanisms for dealing with counterproliferation, export controls, rigorous attempts to stop other technologies and scientists coming into the country, those traditional measures of arms control aren't going to work if the country has developed an indigenous capability, an indigenous technological infrastructure, which Iranians are in the progress of developing. So what does the United States diplomacy can do to ameliorate this situation? Well, as I mentioned, I think an effective, imaginative United States diplomacy can potentially exploit Iran's divisions, internal divisions, in favor of those who advocate restraint, against those who advocate proliferation. About 2 years ago or so, Henry Kissinger wrote an interesting piece. He said that Iran has to decide whether it's a cause or a nation, cause or a state. I don't think he was aware of this, but perhaps he was, that there is a debate within Iranian intellectual circles, nation or a movement. Are we a nation or are we a movement? I think United States diplomacy should say to the Iranians, we are willing to concede and accept Iran's legitimate national aspirations. But we are not willing to concede Iran's revolutionary aspirations. So you have a choice, become a cause or a state, a nation or a movement. And you get to choose. In one case, you can be a member of the international community, realize your national objectives as a member of that community, but the price of that is adherence to certain norms, certain rules, and certain laws of conduct. And it'd be the first time that Iran would be offered that choice by the only country that can offer it that choice, the United States. And they'll get to choose. I don't know how they're going to opt, frankly. I don't know that. But I think that type of an American diplomacy will provoke the most important internal debate the Islamic Republic has ever had. And hopefully, if such diplomacy is in evidence, Iran will make the right decision. And getting Iran right, I think, can go a long way towards stabilizing the entire Middle East, strengthening the global nonproliferation regime, and advancing the cause of stability in a volatile but strategically critically important region. So I'll stop there and entertain whatever questions, comments.
Well, thank you very much for two very interesting presentations. We're going to open now. We'll open the floor for questions. We'd appreciate it if you talk into microphones because we are filming the event. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. And it would be terrific if you would introduce yourself.
My name is Nina McClone, and I work with Cleveland Peace Action locally. Thank you for your interesting talks. I am concerned, however, that I found them both misleading in certain respects, and I'd like to share my concerns about that. And in many respects, it has to do with what you didn't say, not so much all the time as what you did say. Ambassador Sherman, you listed the nuclear states, but excluded Israel. I think that's very important that we understand that Israel also has nuclear weapons and has had them for some time. They don't like to admit it, but we all know that they're there. In terms of what we can do, there are things that I'd like to mention that I thought are very important that I felt you did omit. One is that the United States has not signed many important treaties that, or abrogated them. For example, the ABM Treaty, and we haven't signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and others. One of the aspects of that I understand is that we are afraid to have our facilities inspected. We have also had, under the Bush administration, a first strike use of nuclear weapons. That has hardly set a good example for the world. The administration has moved, in many respects, stopped by Congress repeatedly to develop new nuclear weapons, and I'm sure we have biological and chemical weapons programs. And we have just approved the deal with India, which seems extremely hypocritical under the circumstances. You hadn't commented on that, and if the United States is going to be a leader in toning down the dangers, all of these things need to be looked at. We are particularly concerned about the India deal, which doesn't inspect weapons facilities and allows us to sell materials. Dr. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, I'm sorry.
I was named after an actual.
You say with such certainty that Iran has a weapons program. I didn't think it was that certain. Certainly the leadership has said over and over again that their program is for nuclear energy, which they need, and we used to help them with it back a ways. You did not mention that the government some time ago has said that it would work with the international community on an international enrichment program, and after all, they're being inspected all the time by the IAEA. So I don't understand your sort of blanket confidence that they in fact have a weapons program. So I'd appreciate your comments on those things.
Those were excellent comments. And some of the reason that I didn't mention all of those is that I would have taken an hour to go through them all, but I'm glad that you added them. Let me say a little bit about several of them. I actually had Israel written down in my notes, and that's just my being too tired. So Israel is presumed to have nuclear weapons. They rely on ambiguity about that for a whole number of reasons, but you're quite right about that. On CTBT, the test ban treaty, I am a strong proponent of the United States Senate ratifying the CTBT. The Bush administration has been a strong opponent of the CTBT. Some of our nuclear scientists do not want the CTBT ratified because they worry that technology will develop in such a way that there will be a reason they will need to test to maintain our nuclear deterrence. And so they are worried about giving up the right to test, even though we have a moratorium on testing and we abide by that moratorium, as does Russia. We have an agreement with Russia on a moratorium, and we invite other states into that moratorium. The other reason is that there is a lot of discussion in the military community about what's called a reliable replacement warhead. And the reliable replacement warhead is because people believe that our stockpile is aging, that we aren't keeping up with technology, and that we need something new. I share your view. I am with Bill Perry and Henry Kissinger and Schultz and I forget the fourth, who all believe that we should get to zero, that we don't need nuclear weapons. And that really is the ultimate solution here. But I believe you could develop a reliable warhead. If you believe you needed one, you could probably develop it without testing by using computer modeling, because I think our technology has gotten that. But that's part of the CTBT debate in our military establishment. ABM is over, and we've moved on. Whether I think we should have abrogated the ABM treaty or not is beside the point. It's now doesn't exist anymore. The first strike, this is the doctrine of preemption that everybody talks about, that it always used to be under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter that we have a right of self-defense, always. I'm talking to the students who may not know all that you know. What the Bush administration did is in its national security strategy, it made it very explicit, when in the past we've made it very implicit. So we always had the right to defend ourselves, but we had never had a first use policy. In other words, if we think somebody's about to attack us, we can attack them first, even though we haven't attacked them. And once that genie is out of the box, once there is a doctrine of preemption, it's very hard to put it away again. And the other thing you've done by having that doctrine of preemption, that we can attack someone even before they've attacked us, if we think they might, is that it then gives other states that we might not like permission to do exactly the same thing. So it is a very dangerous situation that we're in. You're quite right about that. Where India is concerned, in the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, which was just finally agreed to by the United States Congress and signed by the President and then signed with India I don't particularly like that agreement, but on balance, it probably was worth agreeing to rather than not. We probably disagree on this in the sense that, as Albright said, the Director General of the IAEA, it's better to have India partway in the tent than not have them in the tent at all. India has a spotless non-proliferation record, completely spotless. I agree with you. I don't like the fact that we don't know what's going on in their military facilities, and they could create lots of new nuclear weapons, and I don't particularly like a nuclear war with Pakistan. But at the end of the day, on balance, I probably would have voted for it, and I understand that you would not have. The one other point that you didn't mention, that I didn't either, is that we are having a nuclear renaissance in the world in terms of nuclear power. The ability to take material from a nuclear power plant and turn it into fissile material that can be used for a nuclear weapon is nearly impossible, but it's not impossible. And obviously you do, by building a nuclear power plant, learn about nuclear technology. So there are many people in the community that believe that no kind of nuclear power is good, that think that this renaissance in nuclear power, which many people argue we need as part of the arsenal of things to deal with climate change, that we need wind and we need solar and we need biofuel and biomass and conservation, but we also need nuclear power. It does probably create some elements of risk. I don't think they're very high, but a lot of people think they are high.
Sure, if I say a few things about why I refer to it as a program with weapons aspirations. The most compelling evidence toward that conclusion is actually in IAEA's own reports. Namely, there was 16 years of concealment of Iranian nuclear activities. It was not transparent. It was violation of their NPT obligations, and they did not declare their facilities. Number two, they have conducted a number of experiments in terms of high explosions and so forth, and the design of the warheads that are suitable for carrying and exercising nuclear munitions. Number three, there's the discovery of a laptop computer by the German intelligence, I believe, in which Iran had dozens and many nuclear weapon designs and so forth. The Iranian response to the IAEA about explanation of this Iranian laptop that was discovered by European intelligence services is that it's a mere fabrication. They have offered no suitable explanation beyond that. So there's some very practical evidence to suggest that the program has designs other than civilian nuclear energy. However, if Iranians want civil nuclear energy, we have conceded that. All we are asking is for Iran to outsource its uranium enrichment activities. Most countries that rely on nuclear power, the only non-nuclear weapon state that insists on enriching its own uranium is Japan. All others, Sweden, Canada, what have you, tend to actually use international fuel banks. And that has been offered to Iran. It was offered that for that fuel bank to be located in Russia, or perhaps under some sort of an international supervision where they can essentially obtain enrichment from abroad for operation of nuclear reactors. They have rejected that, despite the fact that it's a prevalent and cost-effective practice. Third, a country with such rich depository of oil and gas requiring nuclear energy, I would suspect and I would advise for Iran would be far better to invest $1 billion a year that it is presumed to be spending on its nuclear activity to actually develop its natural gas infrastructure. Iran has the second largest natural gas depository, second to Russia, and I think it's greater than Qatar. And it develops that, it can essentially use that for local and also as an export commodity to LNG and pipelines and so forth, which essentially would benefit both its people and in terms of the giving more energy sources to international consumers and so forth. So for all those reasons, one has to arrive at the conclusion that the intention and motivation behind this program are not just nuclear energy for civilian consumption, but perhaps there are some sinister purposes beyond that.
Other questions? Yes, let's...
Okay, to follow up on Nina's point, I'm just wondering why the United States can't use its leverage as the only superpower to call on all the nations, including the United States, to totally disarm and totally get rid of all weapons of mass destruction. I posed this question to two CIA analysts. Larry Johnson seems to like this idea, whereas Stansfield Turner thinks that it would be dangerous. But I mean, we're all shaking in our boots due to the prospect of being hit with weapons of mass destruction. I mean, we were hit by a weapon of mass destruction on 9/11. The question is, how can we unhypocritically lead a movement toward total disarmament so that any would-be terrorist could not steal or acquire any of these weapons of mass destruction, which would be non-existent. I'm eager to hear your replies.
Is that a piggyback you wanted to jump in? Okay. Yes.
As I said, I agree with what are now known as the Four Horsemen, that we should get to zero. I completely agree. I think that it would be good if the United States, even unilaterally, built down their nuclear weapons even before other people do. We don't need as many as we have. I think we could probably... I think we should get to none. I agree we should get to none. But quite frankly, I am not ready to get to none until I know that we are doing what you're suggesting, which is to lead a worldwide disarmament situation. I don't think I want to live in a situation. I do want to maintain deterrence until I don't need it anymore.
I would just say one thing on that. I think the next president, if he comes in and announces a unilateral cut,
and that may happen.
That
will help.
Yeah.
That will help. But your point is right. It's insane.
I'm Joe White, Director of the Center for Policy Studies. And so first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
Along with Professor Strassfeld, I think I'm one of the hosting organizations. Secondly, in case anybody's interested, there are some other pre-election events going on, and I've left flyers up at the chair there and on the desks there. I'm struck by the certainty with which Ambassador Sherman expresses the fears. There's an industry of fear of terrorism. Graham Allison has become part of that industry, but there's, or to some extent, I think, but it seems to me that, I'm misunderstanding?
No,
Okay. He's being cited as part of the industry. But anyway, there's a whole lot of people who have a lot of reason to say that there's a threat. And hardly anybody who has any reason to play down the threat. Because if you play down the threat and say, look, we shouldn't be so hysterical about these risks, for instance, about bioterrorism, then there's always a chance that you're wrong and you look like a fool. And you don't get any credit for being right because it always could happen next. And John Mueller, in particular, down at Ohio State, has done some compelling writing and speaking about the exaggeration and the fear-mongering involved with the talk of weapons of mass destruction, about the problems with the term itself, which is a pretty awful term.
Terrible.
About the extreme difficulty of doing a biological attack, for example. And so I'm just wondering, aren't we sort of exaggerating this a bit, or why are you so sure that this is the greatest threat to us? I mean, it seems to me that the greatest threat to the United States at the moment is an investment banker with a computer program he doesn't understand.
Wait, you weren't here at the beginning when I said that we'd already destroyed the financial system all by ourselves.
I actually was, but I'm saying there are many grave security threats to the United States.
I don't disagree with you, but and I don't believe in fear-mongering But I also believe in dealing with real life and educating and informing myself to know what, and I'm not saying you're not, what is possible, and then doing my damnedest within reason to try to reduce that risk. And I don't believe the risk of a terrorist using a nuclear weapon is probably greater than 10 or 20%, maybe lower than that. Graham believes it is in the next decade, within the next decade. You may not believe that. Mueller may not believe that it is that high, but based on a heck of a lot of work, I don't think it is nothing. I think it is a threat. Let's take Pakistan, for instance, which has nuclear weapons which are under the control of the Pakistani military right now. There are parts of how it conducts its program that I'm not at liberty to discuss, that creates vulnerabilities for that. Pakistan has terrorists, not only in the Fatah region, but inside Pakistan itself. It has a weak and unstable government. It believes that their entire world is about India attacking it and doing it in. That's why the military exists and is as strong as it is. Their economy is in complete shambles. They've just gone to the IMF. There are a lot of vulnerabilities in that situation, and if there's something that, as an American, I can do, short of taking over the country, because I'm not someone who believes that we should do regime change in that way, or impose ourselves in that way, but if there are things I can do to help create greater stability in Pakistan, I damn well want to do it, because I don't want them to fall apart and those nuclear weapons be sort of running around. I wish that George Bush had negotiated with North Korea from day one so they didn't have 8, 10, 12 nuclear weapons, because North Korea has sold all of its missile technology. The reason Iran has a missile that is on its way to being capable of delivering a nuclear weapon is because North Korea gave them the technology. So there is a network of sharing of technology and information, and we live in a society which we have just seen in this financial crisis that is inextricably linked to each other. Biological, I don't know the answer to that. Probably the greatest biological threat is a pandemic that isn't brought to us by a terrorist. It's just brought to us by nature. But given the human genome sequencing, given the number of labs that have been created all over the world now, not just in the United States, but all over the world, that are doing medical research, which has fabulous possibilities for all of us to lead healthier and longer lives, but also has a dark side to it in terms of creating things out of DNA and out of an understanding of the genome. So I don't want to fearmonger. We've had, in my view, and I'll be a little partisan here, we have had 8 years of fearmongering. I'm tired of it. But I don't want to give up. I don't want to say stop fearmongering and not be realistic about the threats we face and do what we can to reduce them, not to the exclusion of everything else we have to do and not to the exclusion of all the other threats and security issues we have to face. But there is no question in my mind that if someone used a nuclear weapon or someone did find a way to disperse a biological weapon, it would be a game changer, not just for me, but for my daughter and for the world. It would be a game changer.
What game does it change?
It'll change your life. It'll change your ability to travel. It'll change your ability to work. It'll change your ability to see your friends and neighbors. It will change a great deal in our world.
We had a question up here, this gentleman.
Walter Nichols. Dr. Sherman. Okay. I was impressed by your observation that we're competing systems more rather than competing nations. Mm-hmm. I guess the old way of waging wars for colonies or power or balance of power, nations did that. Okay, and that kind of toxic politics was to some extent reined in by the United Nations and NATO and other forms was recognize that this is a toxic form of politics. But how do you rein in different systems when you have competing systems? And basically, how do you rein in the basic worldwide contest between capitalism and socialism? And to what extent does that impact the nuclear struggle in Iran and that type of?
Well, I guess I don't see systems as necessarily competing in the same way it was the United States and the Soviet Union. I don't see a sort of I'm on this side or I'm on that side. It's much more diffuse. It means that nation states still matter. The United States, as the last remaining superpower, still matters. We still are, in spite of all the horrors we have been through lately, an incredibly strong country in many, many ways. A little misguided at the moment, but a very strong country. What I think everybody needs to understand is that those systems and those interconnections exist, that there is an asymmetry, that right now I believe that nation states still have more control than less control, but there could be a tipping of the balance so that no one has control, or so that non-state actors have control. Bad non-state actors. There are also good non-state actors. NGOs are a non-state actor, and I think they do good. So not all non-state actors are bad, but it is whether we tip the balance in this, and it is why I think the calls here tonight for collective action to try to move toward disarmament requires leadership that comes out of the White House and someone who's willing to take that on. I hope that we elect that person who's willing to do that.
We have a question over here.
Roberta Waxman-Lentz. I'm one of the co-directors of the Cleveland chapter of the National Security Network, and welcome, and we're very glad to have you here. I wanted to ask about the way in which I think over the past 8 years we've given up several opportunities to work with Russia in being able to leverage the relationship to address some of the issues that you've raised. And I'm wondering what explicit, specific steps that we could take in being able to create a relationship that would move some of these kinds of issues forward, despite the fact that there is tension in that relationship.
Wait, why don't you talk a little bit
sure.
around Russia,
Sure.
and then I'll add a few things.
Well, I'm not really a Russia expert, even though I've been to Alaska. But I would say the following things about if you look at it in a sort of a longer history, the Islamic Republic's relations with Russian Federation is actually much better than it was with the Soviet Union. And when the Russians look at Iran, they don't see the sort of dangers that we do. They see a country that they view as been relatively helpful in terms of the near abroad, not necessarily aggravating the ideological and Islamic awakenings in Central Asia. When they see in terms of nuclear capability, the country that they worry most about is Pakistan. That has been mischievous in Chechnya and others, and in terms of stimulating sort of Islamic terrorism. And they have a deep-seated commercial, but it's also a relationship with strategic depth. Sometimes I think Russian-Iranian relations are caricatured as a mercantile relationship. It's actually one that has some degree of strategic partnership and strategic relationship that has evolved between the two countries, and especially now that they're trying to develop more of a cooperative relationship in terms of the natural gas industry and so forth. I would say the current state of relations between the United States and Iran does not benefit Iran. It also doesn't benefit the United States, but in some way it actually benefits Russia. Because on the one hand, by sort of having a seat at the Security Council and others, they can gain some sort of a leverage over U.S.-Russian relations. On the other hand, by watering down the resolutions and having that sort of a role, they can have influence over the Iran. So they're in a nice position. I suspect if the Russians had a choice, they would freeze 2007 forever. They wouldn't want Iran to have nuclear weapons because that does engender instability, but they also wouldn't want an American military intervention, and they also would hope that somehow this thing just stays where it is. So the question is, how do you change the Russian calculus on Iran? There are two competing views of Russia. I don't know which is right. On the one hand, some people suggest that if there are certain concessions made to the Russians, then they can be cooperative on the Iran issues. Some suggest that Russians have reached the limits of their cooperation and any other further concessions will only not necessarily make the situation better and betray America's principles, allies, and so forth. I don't know the answer to that question, frankly. I mean, I just don't know enough about Russian foreign policy to be able to mediate that dispute that divides Russian experts. But I also think that the country that is most important in changing Iran's behavior and attitude is not Russia, it's the United States. It's the United States that has the economic leverage. It is the United States that has the strategic leverage. At the end of the day, as Wendy was saying, the United States is the sole remaining superpower, the indispensable nation. It is the United States that would determine whether Iran can become a member of the global economy and integrated in the international system and access to international lending organizations in the American markets and so forth. So if you want to change Iran's behavior, you deal with Iran. Everybody says, well, we've got to deal with Russians, we've got to deal with the Chinese. Hey, why not deal with the Iranians? So I would say that the Russians are important, and there's an interesting relationship between Russia and Iran, but the most important country in Iran's calculations in terms of its weapons and other aspects of Iran's behavior remains the United States.
And just two quick things. I was in Moscow not long after the Georgia catastrophe, and all of the people who work on cooperative threat reduction, on nuclear security, on START, all of them were ready to meet. We had very professional relationships. There are many places where the U.S. and Russia still work side by side on things. I think we should work together on Pakistan. I think we should work together on North Korea, which we do. I think Russia's being a little humbled at the moment. Its stock market is in the tank, and oil prices are going down. So it tends to remind people that there are cycles to life, and you're not always going to have everything you want. But we're going to have tensions with Russia. There's no question about it. Russia had an enormous loss of pride and dignity when the Soviet Union broke up. I think that what the U.S. did on Kosovo was right in and of itself. What the U.S. did on NATO enlargement was right in and of itself. I don't agree with basing the radar installations in the Czech Republic and Poland. But doing them all together at the same time through Russia's eyes, we're seen as ganging up on Russia. So I think one of the very difficult things when you are doing government policy is not to think about each thing discretely, but to understand what it's going to do about bilateral and geopolitical relationships. Sometimes you got to deal with the strife that comes from it because it's the right thing to do, but you need to be cognizant. So that's not to say Russia wasn't responsible for its ridiculous action. It was. But there was a landscape that added to it.
We have time for two more questions, and I would like to exercise my authority here as moderator to ask one of them. So I teach international politics, and so this question really comes from an issue that I've been struggling with. It's not, the topic we're discussing tonight is not one of my areas of research, but I always cover it in my syllabus. So at least a week or 2 weeks to nonproliferation and the theoretical and empirical evidence. Waltz. Kenneth Waltz is the canon. He's a theoretician in my field, and his argument is a gradual spreading of nuclear weapons leads to more stability and a greater probability of peace than not. So I would like to ask you, do I need to ditch this? Is there any shred of evidence? Now, you spoke directly to this issue. So maybe, Ambassador Sherman, would you address this question to a professor of to international politics, please?
Theoretically, if everyone can deter everyone else, I suppose he has something to say. But that's theoretical. That's as if on day one, everybody has the same thing, and that's not how it works. It doesn't work in a symmetrical way and equally distributed fashion. And because it doesn't work in an equally distributed fashion, and on day one everyone has exactly the same thing, you don't have mutual assured deterrence. Now, I would like to get deterrence in plenty of ways. Nuclear weapons is not my favorite deterrence instrument, And because it can't all be done all at once, all the same, and it's unbelievably costly, I think it's theoretical proposition and not a realistic one. Would you agree?
Yeah, because that theory doesn't count as, then you're saying for asymmetry, is that if one country has a first strike capability and it has an adversarial relationship with that country, it might be tempted toward preemption before that country gains the necessary capability as well. So it presumes a level of consistency and equality in terms of distribution of nuclear weaponry. It doesn't account for the temptation of preemption when there's an imbalance of that power.
Hope that helps your class.
Thank you. One last question.
Dr. Takeyh, regarding your comment on Iran and you saying it faces no existential threats, well, come on, just a few short years ago when we invaded Iraq, the neocons were gloating. They were talking about onto Syria and onto Tehran. It's pretty clear. We can argue here endlessly, but neoconservatives are arguably a Jewish ethnic movement, heavily funded by Jews. Leading thinkers, Douglas Feith, Richard Perle, Wolfowitz, they're Jewish, they've ever spied for Israel, so forth. They're talking about invading Iran. Clearly, Iran, at that point, it was just rational for Iran to have a nuclear weapon to deter the United States if we're going to talk about destroying their society. Within Israel, they've spoken about destroying Arab societies, especially Iraq, given its vast oil wealth. And you could argue that Israel has won big from the Iraq war. So there seems to be a tendency either we're pathologizing Iran's interests or we're patronizing them, saying they don't face any threat. When I can show you the Weekly Standard magazines and people like Feith and Perle and Wolfowitz, even to this day, they were planning, or they still are, the transformation of Iran. So I don't think if you could comment how you arrived at that point of view about Iran not facing an existential threat, I'd be curious.
I want Ray to respond, but first I want to say I do hope you do believe that not all Jewish people are neoconservatives.
Well, specifically talking about neoconservatives, this question.
Okay. The existential threat in terms of a country seeking to destroy the regime of another country through application of military force. I would suggest that Iran has not faced that, even in 2001 and 2002. The administration was talking about regime change on the cheap. They were hoping to alter the Iranian regime by sort of stimulating revolutionary pressures within Iran. And they thought that the invasion of Iraq would somehow transform the Middle East. The invasion of Iraq was not specifically about Iraq, but transformation of the Middle East political culture, and essentially recalcitrant regimes like Iran and Saudi Arabia and others would rise up and have some sort of a reformist government. There would be tsunami democratic effect. That was very inconceived conceptually and practically, but that's hardly an existential threat the way, for instance, Pakistan perceives itself as facing with India and so forth. Sure. I'm just saying that Iran does not face that sort of an existential challenge when it faces another adversary seeking to destroy its regime. And more importantly, to talk about existential threat that Iranians face, they actually don't talk about facing existential threats. You talk about the Weekly Standard, but Iranian press and Iranian politicians and Iranian intellectuals don't talk about facing an existential threat. They do face threats. But an existential threat is measurably and qualitatively different. Now, if you can tell me which Iranian politician has ever talked about existential threat being faced to their country from anywhere, Israel, America, and so forth, then that your argument will have at least some data. At this point, it does not. So I think Iran faces threats. I think at times it exaggerates those threats. Second of all, why is Iran's nuclear program persisting with such alacrity today? Nobody is talking about invasion and occupation of Iran. At least I'm not aware of it. So why do they still continue to have a nuclear program? If their nuclear program was conditioned on threats, and in 2002 they read Weekly Standard and said, well, this is serious, then why is the program persisting today? Why did the program start in 1974? Was the Weekly Standard hadn't come into existence then? So this is a program that is much more deliberate, and it's predicated on assumptions other than American enmity. Now, I'm willing to blame a lot of things on the Weekly Standard, but an Iranian nuclear program that began in 1972 might be kind of a stretch. Sure.
Especially created and funded to promote war in the Middle East. As for why Iran is pushing for weapons now, nuclear weapons now, perhaps it's because they thought that the destruction of Lebanon in '82 and in 2006, and absolutely nothing was done by the United States. We didn't recall our ambassador in either occasion. Given Shia Lebanon, that might be a good reason for them to acquire, watching their Shia brethren being destroyed like that. That might have prompted it.
Well, except Iranians celebrated 2006 war as a great triumph for Hezbollah. They don't suggest that was a defeat mandating provision of nuclear weapons.
What about the 1982 destruction?
The 1982, the military intervention of Israel in 1982 is actually a complicated issue. Well, fine. And it had to do with the factors of the differences between Syrians and Israelis. And you should know that Syrians actually wanted Israel to intervene and expel the PLO forces. And the Shiis that have obviously galvanized your concern welcomed the Israeli intervention in the first place because the presence of the Palestinian forces in Israel, in southern Lebanon, which provided them a privileged sanctuary for attacking Israel, had created a great degree of tensions between southern Lebanon and the state of Israel. And the United States' response was, through Philip Habibi and others, to have some sort of a mediation and resolution of that conflict and essentially try to prevent that conflict from getting beyond its parameters. So, a little history is a dangerous thing. In your hands, utterly toxic. So.
All right. Well, I want to thank Ambassador Sherman and Dr. Ray Takeyh for terrific discussion, very stimulating. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Okay,